Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. The story you are about to hear is not meant for comfort. It is not a tale of triumph or resilience, but of decay, of bloodlines tangled into knots so tight that even time itself struggles to pull them apart. In the misted hollows of Appalachia, where the mountains conceal more than they reveal, there once lived a family whose very existence was born from a secret so unspeakable that even the grave seems reluctant to hold it. Their lives, their children, their entire lineage were shaped by an arrangement that defied both God and nature. A mother, not bound to one husband, but swapped between two brothers, her body, her womb, her identity, reduced to an object of trade within her own household. And from that silent transaction, an entire clan emerged. This was not just poverty's doing, nor the cruelty of circumstance, but a choice woven into the fabric of isolation. A choice that grew into ritual, one that became whispered folklore among the nearby townsfolk. They called them strange, they called them cursed, but no one dared to intervene. For in those mountains, families guarded their secrets like wolves guard their dens, and any outsider who pried too deeply risked never returning. The photographs that survive today are haunting. Faces that do not align, eyes that wander in opposite directions, children whose very features seem to cry out against the blood that made them. These are not just images of hardship, but of a genetic spiral collapsing inward, generation after generation. Yet behind each distorted face was a story of a mother who bore children she could not name with certainty, of brothers who shared not only her, but the twisted legacy of their choices, and of offspring who never knew where one parent ended and the other began. And as we unearth this story, we find ourselves asking a question most dare not whisper. When bloodlines become this tangled, does family even exist anymore? Or does it collapse into something else entirely? A tribe of ghosts still alive, their faces etched with the mistakes of those who came before them. This is the story of the most inbred clan ever found. When outsiders first began to stumble upon this family, it wasn't through polite introductions or friendly conversations. It was through whispers, rumors that clung to the smoke-filled taverns and the wooden church pews in nearby towns. Travelers spoke of children who looked older than their years, of mothers who seemed less like women and more like hollowed vessels, and of brothers who lived together in one cabin, their lives intertwined in a way that unsettled even the most hardened mountain folk. It was said that no one could quite tell who fathered whom. A boy might be called son by one brother on Monday and by the other on Tuesday. The mother never corrected them. Perhaps she had long ago surrendered to the confusion, or perhaps she knew that in the end it made no difference. Blood had been mixed so many times that the boundaries of kinship had dissolved. What remained was something else, something that both fascinated and horrified those who heard of it. Neighbors, when pressed, spoke cautiously. Some remembered seeing the family in town, moving in a small tight pack, eyes averted, voices hushed. Others recalled their appearances as something they couldn't quite describe without shuddering, faces too symmetrical in one place and asymmetrical in another, eyes that did not seem to look outward but inward, as though the very blood in their veins carried secrets too heavy for a child to bear. The mother, they said, had once been beautiful, or at least beautiful enough to draw the attention of two brothers in a region where women were scarce and choices were limited. But beauty in isolation becomes something different. It becomes property, and she, perhaps against her will, became a vessel passed back and forth. The men did not compete for her, they shared her, and the children she bore were not given the privilege of clarity, of knowing where they came from or who they were meant to be. In a land already plagued by poverty, superstition, and silence, this arrangement became a ritual of survival. But survival at what cost? For every child born into that household carried not just the name of the family, but the unmistakable marks of its curse. The horror of this clan is not in the violence of murder or war, but in the quiet, unbroken cycle of intimacy twisted back upon itself. It was not a single act that condemned them, but the repetition of it, year after year, generation after generation. By the time investigators, genealogists, and curious researchers would later piece together the fragments of this story, the damage had already been done. The children of this family grew into adults, and the adults into elders, but none of them ever truly escaped the shadow of their origin. Their bodies bore the record of it, their faces an unspoken confession that needed no words. And yet, beyond the physical, there was something else, something more disturbing than any crooked smile or wandering eye. It was the silence. Inside that household, silence was law. The brothers never spoke of their arrangement, for to speak it aloud would have meant acknowledging the grotesque pact they had made. The mother, trapped between them, surrendered her voice as well. Her children grew up in a world where questions were not asked, where the truth was something too dangerous to give shape to. And so the silence stretched on, binding them tighter than any rope. This silence spilled into the surrounding hills. Neighbors may have known, or at least suspected, but in Appalachia, one learns early not to meddle in another man's home. Poverty breeds its own laws, and survival often means turning your head from what unsettles you. Still, there was a quiet unease that surrounded this family wherever they went. Children in town would whisper cruel jokes, calling them cursed, touched, or unnatural. Adults avoided their eyes, as if by meeting their gaze they might glimpse something they could never unsee. The clan grew insular, retreating further into the woods. What began as shame soon became isolation, and what began as isolation soon became tradition. Within a few generations, the family was no longer just an oddity. It was a closed circle. Outsiders became strangers, strangers became threats, and the only bonds that mattered were those within the bloodline itself. The brothers were gone. But the system they began continued. Sons took mothers, cousins took sisters, and daughters grew up knowing that their children would never truly belong to anyone but the family itself. What we see here is not just the story of one household, but the chilling truth of how cycles of silence can calcify into destiny. Once a family begins to collapse in on itself, it does not stop at one generation. It spirals, deeper and deeper, until what remains is almost unrecognizable, until the word family no longer means kinship, but prison. As the years dragged on, the family became something more myth than flesh to the outside world. Their cabin, crouched in the woods like a forgotten relic, was both feared and avoided. Hunters who strayed too close spoke of hearing strange cries at night, neither animal nor human. Travelers whispered of figures glimpsed at the tree line, bodies moving in jerks and shadows, eyes glinting strangely in the moonlight. But rarely did anyone approach, and fewer still dared knock upon their door. When the rare visitor did make contact, what they encountered was unforgettable. Children who did not speak, only stared. Adults whose words came out broken, garbled, or not at all. Some could not walk properly, shuffling on twisted limbs, their joints bent as though their bodies had forgotten how to move through the world. Others seemed perfectly still, eyes wide and vacant, as if they lived in a different place entirely, somewhere beyond the reach of language or reason. The mother was long gone by then, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on that cursed patch of land. But her presence lingered in every face that remained. She was the root, and her choice, or her surrender, had echoed down into her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, until the line itself was more like a reflection bouncing endlessly off cracked mirrors. Scientists who would later examine the family spoke clinically of genetic bottlenecks, of recessive traits made dominant by relentless repetition. But their words, cold and detached, could not capture the reality of what the locals had lived beside for generations. This was not science to them. It was haunting. It was the embodiment of a warning they carried in their bones, that when blood is turned inward too many times, it begins to eat itself alive. And yet, within that horror, there is something almost more disturbing. These people were not monsters. They were victims. Victims of isolation, of poverty, of a world that turned its back on them long before their blood turned against itself. Each child born into that family never asked for the life they were given. Each one carried the weight of choices they never made. And in that sense, their suffering was not just the family's shame, but the region's, perhaps even the nation's, for we allowed them to fade into silence, to become a legend of deformity, rather than a cry for help. The truth is this: the most inbred clan ever found did not simply exist, they endured, and their endurance is what makes their story all the more terrifying. If you are still watching, you are already braver than most. For this is the part of the story where the veil grows thinner, where what was whispered in shadow begins to take its full shape. And now, we must face the question that hovers like a ghost over this family's legacy. What does it mean to be born into a bloodline that was never meant to survive? By the mid-20th century, when researchers finally set foot on that land, the family had already become a living archive of genetic collapse. Some members could not form coherent speech, others could only grunt, moan, or shriek. Entire branches of the clan communicated not with words, but with sounds closer to animals than men. Still, they were not beasts. They cooked their food, they built their fires, they recognized each other, they lived and they endured, despite the world turning its back on them. The brothers who once shared their mother were long gone, but their experiment in survival lingered. What began with one woman being traded between two men had grown into a network of cousins, siblings, parents, and children whose identities were no longer distinct. In some cases, a man was both uncle and father to the same child. A woman was both cousin and mother to another. The family tree was no longer a tree at all. It was a circle, closing in tighter with each generation. What outsiders saw as grotesque, the family accepted as ordinary. And in that acceptance lies the deepest horror. For when the abnormal is repeated enough times, it becomes tradition, and tradition, once rooted, is nearly impossible to break. Those who documented this family often did so with a mix of fascination and disgust, but rarely compassion. To them, these people were specimens, bodies to be photographed, conditions to be studied. The raw humanity of their suffering was often stripped away, replaced with cold statistics and detached analysis. But beneath those reports lived real people who laughed, cried, feared, and loved in their own fractured way. What strikes hardest is this: they did not know the difference. To them, this was life. It was only outsiders who saw it as nightmare. And perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all: that you can live inside horror so long that it ceases to be horror at all. It simply becomes home. There is a photograph, one that has circulated among researchers, journalists, and the curious who stumble too close to the truth. In it, 3 members of the family stand before the decaying porch of their home. Their clothes are tattered, their shoes worn through, but it is not poverty that unsettles the viewer. It is their faces. One stares cross-eyed, lips pulled back in a half-smile that looks more like pain than joy. Another, older, leans forward as though the weight of his head is too much for his neck to bear. The third does not look at the camera at all. Instead, his gaze drifts somewhere far away, lost in a silence that no one can break. It is these images that continue to haunt those who discover the clan, because a photograph freezes time, and in that stillness, the reality becomes undeniable. This was not a myth. This was not folklore. This family existed, and their story is carved not just in memory, but in bone, in flesh, in every distorted feature preserved in those portraits. As outsiders, we are quick to recoil, to feel pity laced with revulsion, but to look at them longer is to feel something heavier, guilt. For this family is not just a reflection of their own choices, but of ours, of a nation that allowed entire pockets of people to sink into isolation so deep that even the laws of kinship unraveled. We want to believe that America is a land of progress, of opportunity. Yet stories like this one remind us that there are places where time did not move forward, where survival bent back upon itself, and where forgotten families became trapped in cycles too dark to escape. Historians often say that to study the past is to study ourselves. But when confronted with a lineage like this, what are we seeing? A family destroyed by taboo? A warning about the dangers of silence? Or a mirror held uncomfortably close to our own tendency to ignore what we do not wish to see? The brothers who once shared a mother are long gone, their names swallowed by dirt and time. But their legacy endures, immortalized in the children who bore their blood and in the photographs that refuse to fade. And it forces us to ask how many other families like this might have existed, hidden just beyond the reach of history, their stories never told, their faces never seen. The story of this clan does not end with shock. It ends with a silence that is somehow worse. For when the world finally took notice, when reporters, genealogists, and the morbidly curious came to the hollows to document what was left, the family could no longer hide. Their isolation was shattered. Strangers with cameras stepped onto their land, pointing lenses at faces that had known nothing but secrecy. Some family members shrieked and scattered into the woods like frightened animals. Others stood frozen, staring directly into the glass eye of history, as if daring it to record what it had never been meant to see. And record it did. The photographs, the reports, the interviews, they spread. To outsiders, the family became a grotesque fascination. The clan was branded a symbol of inbreeding, of what happens when bloodlines fold in upon themselves. People consumed their tragedy like a spectacle, forgetting that behind each image was a human life, lived in quiet suffering. The brothers who had first shared their mother had never imagined that their private pact would echo into the world this way. What began as silence ended as exposure, and exposure is its own form of cruelty. The surviving descendants live in the shadow of that exposure. Some remain in the hills, shunning outsiders, their lives still defined by secrecy. Others moved away, trying desperately to escape the weight of their name, their faces, their blood. But history is not so easily outrun. Their family became a symbol not just of taboo, but of America's hidden corners, the places where progress never reached, where silence became law, and where bloodlines bore scars that can never heal. What makes this story unforgettable is not the deformities, not the haunting photographs, not even the pact between two brothers and their shared wife. It is the way we, as a society, respond to such a story. We look, we recall, we whisper, and then we turn away. But the faces remain. The children who never chose their fate remain. The memory of a mother reduced to an object of exchange remains. And whether we admit it or not, their story is part of our story. In the end, the most inbred clan ever found is more than a curiosity. It is a warning carved into the bones of Appalachia itself, a reminder of what happens when silence replaces compassion, when isolation replaces community, and when survival is twisted into something that no longer resembles life.